Hello and welcome to this virtual module on SBP EU RED requirements, version covering RED 3. In this session, we'll explore the latest SBP EU RED solution and essential compliance aspects of the EU Renewable Energy Directive as they relate to SBP certification. Whether you're new to these requirements or looking for a refresher, this module will guide you through the key points and most up-to-date requirements. Let's get started. Let me start with some background on SBP's position. SBP has a strategic objective to obtain and maintain all relevant regulatory approvals, and this includes the EU Renewable Energy Directive. SBP aligns with EU RED to provide certificate holders with a recognized framework and technical solutions for demonstrating compliance with these regulatory requirements. Under SBP Standards version 2, EU RED compliance is mandatory for all certificate holders, so it is essential that every certificate holder understands how it works. Previously, during the transition period to version 2, EU RED could be added voluntarily to the scope. Now, with only version 2 valid, EU RED is mandatory for all SBP certificates. And finally, an important reminder. The specific EU RED requirements are defined by the European Commission, not by SBP. SBP's role is to bridge those requirements into its own normative framework. Before we go further, let's clarify what we mean by EU RED. EU RED refers to the EU Renewable Energy Directive. It is a European Union regulation that sets sustainability and greenhouse gas savings criteria for biomass used in energy production. Its purpose is to ensure that renewable energy contributes to climate targets, while also protecting biodiversity, land use, and forest carbon balance. Whenever we refer to EU RED in this module, we mean the latest currently effective version of the directive. At present, this is the Renewable Energy Directive EU-2023-2413, commonly known as RED 3. In this session, we will not provide more information about the directive itself and its role on legislative framework of the EU. There is plenty of resources online if you want to do a deeper dive, including informative and entertaining videos on YouTube. Now, let's look at the key milestones in the EU RED and SBP timeline. SBP was originally approved by the European Commission for RED 2 in 2022. The updated Renewable Energy Directive, RED 3, was published in the official journal of the European Union on the 31st of October 2023. Member states then had until the 21st of May 2025 to transpose and implement the necessary laws and regulations. SBP itself was approved by the Commission for RED 3 in April 2025. All SBP certificate holders with EU RED in their scope had to update their management systems to the RED 3 version of the EU RED normative documents by the 21st of May 2025. Certification bodies verify conformance with RED 3 during regular audits, starting from the same date. To summarize, as of early 2026, all SBP certificate holders with EU RED in scope need to comply with RED 3, and this is being checked during their regular audit. SBP decided to develop a separate set of normative requirements specifically for EU RED. It was not technically or operationally feasible to embed all EU RED requirements directly into the SBP standards, because those requirements are slightly different from SBP's own, and they can change outside SBP's control. If the European Commission modifies EU RED, it could otherwise force SBP to constantly update its standards. EU assessors also explicitly preferred that voluntary schemes create a separate EU RED document set to simplify their assessment. Because the requirements in SBP standards and in EU RED do not always match, SBP chose to bridge or link them. This is where the name bridging instruction document comes from. On this slide, you can see examples of how EU RED requirements have been bridged into the main SBP normative framework. The glossaries were compared and merged, with the combined glossary included in the bridging ID. Sustainability requirements in SBP Standard 1 and those in EU RED Article 29 are worded differently, so Section 1 of the EU RED Bridging ID explains how EU sustainability requirements are implemented through the SBP supply base evaluation concept. When you read the SBP EU RED document, you will notice that many requirements are very similar and sometimes identical to SBP ones. However, the EU requires that the legal text from the directive is used, and that is why some redundancy is unavoidable. Here you can see the list of published SBP EU RED documents. First, the instruction document EU RED, bridging requirements for meeting the Renewable Energy Directive EU 2023-2415. This is the main document in the SBP EU RED solution. It contains the glossary, sustainability requirements, chain of custody requirements, certification body requirements, guidance for level A and level B risk assessments, and other specific EU RED provisions. We will come back to this document later in the module. Second, the instruction document, EU RED's Principles for Management of EU RED Scheme. This document is not used directly in certification or accreditation. Instead, it describes how the SBP scheme and its actors operate: governance, training, impartiality, the assurance system, and so on. Third, Instruction Document 6D on methodology for the calculation and certification of GHG emission savings for EU RED. Within the broader SBP framework, this document is optional, but it is mandatory for certificate holders that need to perform GHG emission savings calculations in line with RED 3. Next, the certification body RED audit report template is a mandatory, complementary checklist used by certification bodies to document SBP EU RED audits. It is confidential and does not appear in the public summary report, but certification bodies can integrate it into their internal audit tools as long as the content is kept. We also have RED 3 Level A risk assessments. These may be developed by SBP itself under the SBP RA procedure or recognized from other voluntary schemes or authorized organizations. Finally, SBP has developed the proof of sustainability. This document is used to pass EU RED compliance information outside SBP's own traceability tools, such as the SAR report and the DTS. All EU RED 3 documents are available on the SBP website at the link shown on the slide. Let's summarize the EU RED 3 sustainability requirements in the context of SBP. EU RED is additional to the main SBP standards, it does not replace them. Compliance with EU RED is mandatory under Standards version 2, so each version 2 certificate must have EU RED in its scope. EU RED sustainability criteria include sustainable harvesting requirements under Article 29, Paragraph 6, such as legality, regeneration, biodiversity, soil quality, harvest levels and restricted areas, and forest carbon balance requirements under Article 29, Paragraph 7 on LULUCF. Under RED 3, sustainability criteria for forest biomass also incorporate the agricultural biomass criteria in Article 2009, Paragraph 2 to 5. For forest biomass, compliance is based on a risk-based approach with level A and level B pathways. This risk-based mechanism is not allowed for TOF under EU RED. Trees outside forests are covered by agricultural criteria with partial and full no-go areas defined in Article 29, Paragraph 2 to 5, and again, no risk-based approach is permitted. For processing residues and post-consumer feedstock, there are no EU RED sustainability criteria, only GHG emission savings apply, although SBP's own requirements still apply under other standards. On this slide, we compare the sustainable harvest criteria in Article 29, Paragraph 6 under RED 2 and RED 3. If you are not familiar with RED 2, you can still use this as background. Under Article 2009, Paragraph 6, only 3 indicators remained exactly the same: legality, regeneration, and long-term forest production capacity. Other indicators were modified or newly introduced. The RED 3 sustainable harvest criteria are shown in the red box. You may notice that some of the wording looks very similar to indicators in SBP Standard 1. That is intentional, but, as explained earlier, EU RED uses its own legal language, which is why these criteria are set out in the EU RED bridging document rather than only in Standard 1. The previous slide addressed sustainable harvesting under Article 2009, Paragraph 6. Here we look at LULUCF requirements under Article 29, Paragraph 7. In this case, the good news is that the criteria have not changed. The LULUCF provisions remain the same in RED 3 as they were in RED 2, so there are no new requirements here compared to the previous directive. This is a very important slide as it explains the level A and level B compliance pathways for forest biomass under EU RED. Compliance with the forest biomass requirements can be demonstrated in two ways. Level A means compliance through national or subnational legislation and the associated monitoring and enforcement systems. Level B applies where compliance cannot be shown through legislation alone or where a recognized Level A risk assessment is not available. In that case, compliance must be demonstrated through management systems at the forest sourcing area level. This Level A and Level B approach reflects the risk-based concept in EU RED. If a country has strong legislation and enforcement, the risk of unsustainable forest biomass is low at national level. Where this is not the case, more detailed checks are needed at the sourcing area level. Biomass producers are not allowed to develop Level A risk assessments themselves. Level A assessments must follow the SBP regional risk assessment procedure or be recognized from the European Commission, national authorities, or other recognized voluntary schemes. As of January 2026, SBP Level A RED 3 risk assessments are available for Denmark, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Canada, the US, and Vietnam, but you should always check the SBP website for the latest list. SBP has also published a document on recognized RED Level A risk assessments for Articles 29, paragraph 6 and 7 on forest biomass. Another important point is that the existence of a Level EU RED risk assessment does not automatically mean that all sustainable harvest indicators are covered at Level A. This affects countries with SBP regional risk assessments, such as Denmark, the Baltic states, Canada, the US, and Vietnam. The main issue is that some of the newly defined no-go and restricted areas in RED 3 are not fully protected by national law. For example, logging in primary or old-growth forests may still be legally allowed. In such cases, certain indicators cannot be treated as low risk at Level A. Where this happens, Level B applies, and biomass producers must develop and implement their own management systems to ensure sustainable biomass sourcing. On the right of the slide, you can see the risk conclusions from the published SBP Level A RED RRA for Estonia, which illustrate this point in practice. To make things slightly more complex, sustainability criteria apply differently to trees outside forest, or TOF. The first category is TOF, from urban and landscape land, for example. End-of-life trees and salvage trees from gardens, parks, shelter belts, landscape areas, and infrastructure outside forests and agricultural land. For this TOF category, no EU RED sustainability requirements apply. Only GHG savings criteria apply, because the land use category is neither forest land nor agricultural land. This is good news from the EU RED perspective. However, it is very important to remember that this is not the case under SBP Standard 1 version 2. Under Standard 1, TOF urban and landscape does have sustainability criteria, and these are defined in Instruction Document ID 1A. The second TOF category concerns agricultural land. This includes TOF residues from agriculture, such as residues from orchards, pastureland, other woody crops, and agroforestry, where wood is a residue, and TOF biomass from agriculture, where wood is the main product, for example, energy wood or short rotation copies. For both of these categories, EU RED agricultural biomass sustainability criteria in Article 29, paragraph 2 to 5 apply. In other words, they are treated as agricultural biomass under RED. Very importantly, risk-based approaches and Level A or Level B pathways are not allowed for these TOF categories. Compliance must be demonstrated directly, for example, by obtaining evidence from landowners that land has not been converted and that it is not peatland or wetland, and by meeting the other indicators listed in the SBP EU RED bridging ID for TOF. A typical example would be woody feedstock sourced from overgrown agricultural land. The biomass producer needs evidence from the farmer that the land meets the EU RED criteria. Finally, we have processing residues and post-consumer feedstock. Under EU RED, these categories are exempt from sustainability requirements. They only need to meet the GHG emission savings criteria. This is a major difference from SBP's own requirements in Standard 2, where there are still sustainability provisions. In practice, keep in mind that an SBP EU RED claim cannot be used without an underlying SBP claim, so this exemption from EU RED sustainability is less significant than it might first appear. Because both SBP's own requirements and EU RED treat processing residues differently from primary feedstock, accurate and truthful feedstock categorization is critical. In the SBP system, processing residues and post-consumer waste must be covered by SBP certification all the way to the point of origin. This means that biomass producers need to include all such suppliers in their certificate scope, maintain records, collect self-declarations, and, where needed, conduct on-site inspections. Certification bodies, in turn, must list all suppliers of processing residues and post-consumer feedstock in their confidential audit reports, including basic supplier information, feedstock category and description, level of control, and confirmation that self-declarations are available. Now let's look at guidance for Level B risk mitigation. The key message is that collaboration across the supply chain is essential. Risk mitigation usually needs to be applied at the forest level, and it is often necessary to delegate risk management tasks to forest-level actors. These actors include forest owners and managers, logging contractors, and wood traders. For example, if the topic is deadwood retention, those carrying out harvesting need to be aware of and committed to retaining an ecologically appropriate amount of deadwood in the forest. This cannot be managed effectively from the pellet mill. It has to be implemented by people on the ground. Another example is clear-cut thresholds. If there are no legally prescribed maximum thresholds, then recommended local practice should be applied by the logging operators. And of course, avoiding sourcing from primary forests, old-growth forests, heathlands, wetlands, and peatlands, with the limited exceptions allowed, is only possible through close engagement with forest managers and loggers who make day-to-day decisions in the forest. Once risk mitigation measures are in place, their effectiveness must be monitored and documented. This relies on collecting appropriate evidence. Examples of verifiers for risk mitigation measures include international and national databases, official maps and satellite imagery, forest management plans and operational or harvesting protocols, the results of audits and inspections, and contractual agreements with suppliers. SBP provides additional guidance on suitable evidence types in Annex C of the SBP EU RED Bridging ID, and this should be used when designing and evaluating mitigation measures. Mass balance requirements under EU RED are largely aligned with those in SBP Standard 4, but there is an important difference regarding the balancing period. Under Standard 4, the mass balance period can be up to 12 months for all feedstock categories. Under EU RED, biomass producers using only primary feedstock, that is forest feedstock, and TOF feedstock, may use a fixed balancing period of up to 12 months. However, for biomass producers using processing residues and post-consumer feedstock, and for all biomass traders, the balancing period is limited to 3 months. Because EU RED requirements are mandatory, these stricter balancing periods must be applied, even though Standard 4 on its own would allow up to 12 months. Let's turn to claims. The formal claim under EU RED within the SBP system is BP EU RED-compliant. This claim must always be used together with either an SBP-compliant or SBP-controlled claim. It cannot stand on its own. In the data transfer system, this EU RED-compliant claim is pre-filled automatically where applicable. There is also a new RED-only claim, but this is only applicable to traders. It is used when a trader receives EU RED biomass certified under another recognized voluntary scheme, such as SURE or ISCCC. In that case, the trader must verify both the certificate and the biomass status of the incoming EU RED-only transaction. These transactions are handled as a special transaction type in the DTS. The trader must obtain a proof of sustainability, and use the POST template to pass data along the supply chain. If SBP certified biomass is mixed with EU RED-only biomass, the entire mix is downgraded to EU RED-only status. Under RED 3, there is a grandfathering clause that allows certain biomass installations to continue operating under the sustainability criteria of the previous directive RED 2 until the 31st of December 2030. As of January 2026, France is the only member state that has made use of this clause. SBP has published detailed guidance on how the grandfathering rules are applied on its website at the link shown on the slide. Next, a few key differences in accreditation requirements when auditing SBP EU RED scope. The first major difference is how non-conformities are classified and handled. Under EU RED, they are grouped into critical, major, and minor. Critical non-conformities include intentional violations, fraud, or other serious breaches that jeopardize the integrity of the scheme, for example, land conversion against Article 29, paragraph 3 to 5, fraudulent issuance or duplication of proofs of sustainability, or deliberate production of wastes or residues. These situations lead either to the refusal of certification or immediate withdrawal of an existing certificate. Major nonconformities cover serious but potentially reversible failures, such as systematic problems with mass balance or GHG data, failure to disclose participation in other voluntary schemes, or failure to provide key information to auditors. These result in refusal of certification or suspension of the certificate, and if they are not corrected within 90 days, the certificate must be withdrawn. Minor nonconformities are isolated issues with limited impact that do not represent a system failure. Under SBP, they must be resolved within 12 months. The second main difference concerns auditing of processing residues and post-consumer feedstock suppliers. Because these feedstocks are exempt from EU RED sustainability criteria, robust verification is critical. Auditors must sample at least the square root of the total number of such suppliers, or 10%, whichever is higher, and the sample should be risk-based with an element of random selection. The existence of the point of origin and the volume supplied must be checked, and the sample should vary from year to year. Additional guidance is given for sawmills and secondary processors. Auditors should confirm that the ratio of main products to residues is realistic and has not been deliberately altered to generate extra residue material. Collecting points, such as biomass producers, must provide the list of all points of origin with self-declarations and volumes, and auditors must verify a sample of these. Remote verification is permitted where appropriate, but on-site checks may be needed if there is doubt about the point of origin. To summarize the key points of this module, EU RED requirements are mandatory for all SBP certificate holders using standards version 2. For forest biomass, compliance with Articles 29, paragraph 6 and 7 is based on a risk-based approach using Level A and Level B pathways. Trees outside forests in urban and landscape land have no EU RED sustainability requirements, but GHG savings still apply. TOF from agricultural land must meet agricultural biomass criteria in Article 29, paragraph 2 to 5 through direct evidence that no risk-based approach is allowed. Processing residues and post-consumer feedstocks are exempt from EU RED sustainability requirements, but SBP's own requirements still apply, especially on traceability and categorization. There are specific differences in how non-conformities are classified and handled, and in how processing residues and post-consumer feedstocks are audited. In most other respects, EU RED requirements are largely aligned with SBP's existing framework. Thank you for your attention and for taking part in this module on SBP EU RED requirements under RED 3. If you have any questions or need further clarification, please feel free to contact our team.